Thanks. Sorry about that. In focusing on technology and literature, I was thinking about the materiality of literature before the internet, actually. And I wanted to start with this one example of an author who experimented with the physicality of the book, the actual technology of the book. So, what I was doing in Postmodern Sublime and Cognitive Fictions was looking at technology not as a theme only, but as a condition, as a way of shaping our thinking. Nietzsche is probably had one of the most cogent expressions of this. When he was typing letters, it was the first time there was a typewriter, and he learned how to type it. And he stopped in the middle of writing a letter to somebody, saying in that letter, even our thoughts too are shaped by our technologies. That's the he recognized that people were going to start thinking differently once you had a typewriter rather than a pen. And there was also a reflection on the materiality of the book. Do many of you know about the Oulipo? It's the French Ouvroir Littérature Potentielle, and that translates to the workshop for potential literature. And the potential is something that could be many things, but is grounded in specific materialities. Raymond Queneau, one of the founders of the Oulipo group, did a famous book known as 100,000 billion poems. And this is how the book was constructed. It was, I think, 10 pages. Yeah. And each page has a sonnet on it, 14 lines. So 10 to the 14th, if you do every combination of lines into as many sonnets as you can write, you will get 100,000, 10 to the 14th, 100,000 billion. That's the project that Queneau put together. Of course, nobody could or would ever read all of those. But the concept and the potential is there and is part of the materiality. Nick Montfort is a electronic literature maker, and Stephanie Strickland, who I wrote about in Postmodern Sublime, was at that time in the 1990s moving from a well-established position and recognized position as a print poet to somebody experimenting in electronic literature. Strickland and I attended the first electronic literature seminar offered by Professor N. Katherine Hayles in 1994 at UCLA. So both Strickland and I at that time were making a transition from the print to the digital. This is Strickland's collaboration with Nick Montfort at MIT. And it's called See and Spar Between. It's also a conceptual concatenation of works, taking lines from Melville's Moby Dick and from Emily Dickinson's poetry, mixing them up into stanzas that are recast by the computer. And whereas Queneau gave you the potential for 100,000 billion poems, that appears fairly modest to the 223 trillion stanzas that Montfort and Strickland put together, and that you can add to by, instead of using Melville and Dickinson, you can put in 2 other authors and make your own. And several have followed up and done their own mixtures, have created their own trillion or so works. Now, this is one aspect that I'd like to, just put in place to reimagine literature by reimagining, or by not taking for granted its materiality. I think that's important. At the same time, I don't think that See and Spar Between is a work of electronic literature that's going to be recognized as such. It seems to me like the Oulipo project. Nobody's ever going to read these. Nobody ever could. All of them. It seems to me that this is conceptual art. Okay, it's a necessary element, and that this concept, I think, will have to be a part of any achieved electronic literature. But also there's interaction, that other readers can also make their own by using the program, which is freely available. These things are necessary to have an electronic literature, to have a born digital writing. But it seems to me that if you're not spending sustained acts of attention over time, reading and hearing and interacting with a work, then you don't have something comparable to, for example, a novel, or comparable to a film that's a work of art. That's something that has yet to emerge. And I'm going to give you some examples of what that emergence might look like. One more thing to say first, though, about Oulipo and this. These conceptual works are very much aware of the sciences. And that, too, I think, is a necessity in what we're doing. And I mentioned the seminar by Katherine Hayles. She looked at the way, in her book on the post-human, and also in My Mother Was a Computer, where her mother really was a computer. They called secretaries who typed in material on the digital machines, computers. So that's where the term came from. The conceptual materials in place were already there in the 1950s. Computation was realized, and it was realized at the Macy conference after World War II in New York. At that conference, you had scientists, computer scientists, anthropologists like Gregory Bateson and Margaret Mead, all meeting and all talking about the sociological and cultural effects of this. You had Norbert Wiener writing about cybernetics. I would say that the majority of conceptual and material innovation was in place in the 1950s. And I would contrast that with another element that I think is kind of running against the development of an electronic literature. The idea that we have to innovate, and that if we're going to make electronic literature, we have to keep up with the innovations. I would say that it's better to put that aside and not try to keep up and not try to be as smart as the machines we're using. Not try to follow every innovation, because there really have not been substantial and conceptual innovations since the time of the invention of the computers, when they had the big mainframes that took up large buildings. There's, of course, shrinking things down, making things available in the hand of individuals worldwide. That is an innovation, but it's not. There's no conceptual or scientific development there. What Hayles argues in her book is that we should not just look at the numbers. And of course, the large numbers here are part of the concept in the two images I've shown. We should look at the way that consciousness is embedded and embodied in our technologies. That too is something that has to be enacted, has to be felt if we're going to have literature. So my argument here today is that any e-lit, any electronic literature worthy of literary attention and exploration needs to enact and make known our present digital modes of embeddedness, our modes of embodiment, our modes of entanglement with media. Okay? Simply, staying up and keeping up with the new innovations is not going to get you very far. The kinds of devices that we will be reading on, if we're going to be reading literature at all, these are not, there's nothing particularly more advanced about them than there is about the 1950s Macy, early computers. That's been done. So we can't look to technology itself to drive innovation. In fact, what contemporary technology has done has made it harder to have a kind of communal and interactive activity that is necessary to have literary understanding. The only innovations I can think of, just to take two examples, are not scientific. There's the Microsoft innovation by Bill Gates of saying, we're not going to let anyone see the platform that we're using to make this program, to make all of the Microsoft programming that is still very much in use. That went against everything that the early computer scientists took for granted, that you have to share the knowledge in order to advance. And I don't think that has changed. And I think by making invisible the programming, that has been stifling the chances for literary development. Similarly, what has Apple given us? The only innovation I can think of is, I think there's a story about, like Stephen Jobs saying, look, I want it soon, to get rid of this typing of the digital, typing in things, and just, stroke a screen. Okay? That was probably the only real innovation that we have with Apple. It had amazing economical and psychological consequences, but it's not a scientific advance necessarily. In fact, most of the advances are ways of keeping the attention focused on stroking and going to the next thing, keeping that going. And that's, arguably, and I think demonstrably, is connected to the kinds of things that physically we're addicted to. Okay, and that's again part of the reason for the success, but that is precisely not the kind of attention that produces literary value. The argument against Gates, that was made best by Friedrich Kittler in an essay, I think in the 1970s, about code. So I want to look at some examples of works that do, I think, take the right tone. I'm not sure that they're fully realized as literary, but they're doing the kinds of structuring is what I think is the right direction for electronic literature to go in. And also, as I present these, I'm going to present some sites where this work can be found, because that too has to be in place. The ability to come across in the course of one's normal, everyday digital activity, to come across the literary, that's not given. Here we have the Electronic Literature Organization, which is devoted to gathering literary works. And one example by one of the board members of the Electronic Literature Organization is Jason Nelson. A digital poem, retro game, an anti-design statement, and a personal exploration of the artist's changing worldview lens. Much of the Western world's cultural surroundings, belief systems, and designscapes create the built illusion of clean timelines and definitive choice. That's the kind of lines and choices you have all of us have on our devices. And that's precisely what Nelson is going against here. And with his game, and again game. How many games do we play? On the flight here, the two children in the seats next to me were, focused the entire 2 hours, the flight to Houston, were focused the entire 2 hours on their games. It took me about 10 minutes to figure out that it wasn't this thing that you type next if you want to see what's going on, or that thing, that thing will kill you. It's this thing over here. And you can't click and move it. What you have to do is use the space bar. Okay, but that doesn't do it. It helps better if you use, then I figured it out. And now I've got some text. It took that, I just did it in 20 seconds. It took me about 10 minutes to figure this out when I was preparing for the talk. Below this icy spring are animals. The senatorial spring, as parole as population, not human. In the forensic way, things for rooms, saying you are between 50 and 90% of victims and more than half dissipate. All right, let's play the game. Forget the poetry for a minute, and let's go to the next. That didn't work. I was killed by the blue. I'm getting better. Watch. I'm getting better.
How you go?
I'm good. Okay, and now I can get to the next step. I think. Can I? Well, somebody can do it. That is Game, and again Game by Jason Nelson. Some literary works enact a return to the marginalized practice of literary realism and modernism. That's what we've been finding, I think, for the most part, in the print tradition. But there's always a kind of surrealism on these basic, established areas. Within realism, there's always a surreal around the edges. Within modernism, there's always a retro, and things that don't try to be up to date, that don't try to be the next best. That is part of a much longer literary tradition than the tradition of the past 500 years in, let's call it, humanism. And I think if literature is going to emerge, there has to be a bit of surrealism, a bit of edginess, a bit of Dada. There can also be other older forms like epic emerging, and particular terse modes that are always have been there, have a longer tradition than the tradition of print, and I would expect to emerge with the born digital works that we are starting to observe. the purposeful embrace of constraints that one found in Oulipo. Here it was the constraint of the book that Queneau used to create his poetry. The constraint of a program that Strickland and Montfort used to organize lines from Dickinson, and Melville. Constraints can give you freedom. We are all living in the most constrained media world of history, okay? And keeping up with the constraints is not enough unless you understand what the program is. If you don't know, and if the programming is not open access, then you are not knowing what you're doing in the time when you're reading your devices. Okay, you are following them based on exactly patterns of action that are kind of programmed in, instead of choosing yourself where your attention is focused. So there is a need to recognize that if you recognize the constraint and bring it forward, then you can deturn it. You can defamiliarize what's going on. And you can make it new in a more conceptual way, not just in following what's already given to you. That is, again, one of the oldest features that defines what literature is. And it needs to define electronic literature, I would think. Another way of deviating from the norm. Okay? And again, the norms are strongest when you stop being conscious of them. You're going to read a novel. You don't think, this novel is, made of leather, or, well, no, this one is made of, fake leather. You get in and read the novel. You don't think of the materiality. Having that part of the experience is, I think, necessary at this moment when those materialities and the programming is not available. Another way of getting around the edges of the normative is what Rui Torres at the Montreal meeting last year of the Electronic Literature Organization said. And he cites Cortázar. What good is a writer if she can't destroy literature? Okay, that's an extreme version of the deterrent, of the defamiliarization. Okay, you want to make literature strange, because most of the writing we do is utilitarian, informatic. It's not meant to be strange. It's meant to, get things done. That's fine. But literature is about making strange, and it's also about humor. There are places where, in the official world, humor is not desirable, but in literature, it is. And I also wanted to mention the obvious, that the game, and again game, that is functioning humorously. And the humor would not be present if many of us didn't spend times really trying to get that thing to fall down in the games that we're playing. I have a few more works of electronic literature I'd like to show you. This one is by David Jave Johnston, and he has several participants. Let's look at it. It's called Reading Rights.
Okay, so we're going to read it. Art itself is a river. The sun which surrounds it recedes its distance. The dandy art sassafras, dandy drinking of heroic combustible neglect, a face there written on, revived, Fukushima period, portable air, incarceration, public festival stance, phenomenon, Alpha Zero, Eureka, Odysseus, thunderism.
Sorry.
With that one, we could see the computer making the changes while it was scrolling. That's something we could not see in the See and Spar Between from Strickland and Montfort. So that's part of the activity here, is that you actually observe what the program is doing. And again, the program is available and open access.
To a newly scrolled later to the piano, the chair, and our cage kind. And one child said I brought by. The houses chased out bad suits in the wind. Then Nellie walked there, like God, whose mind told us if we live in the land where our shadow, green and wet thing, is full of fear when something sparred or walked down a wall like my son in peace.
Get to stop. The damn LCD tracks. You might descend for a walk. Kill Chlor off at the site and have all your speech in my soul.
That is way more fun. That's like more fun than me going to listen to you read this shit for that shit. It's pretty kind of challenging karaoke to
The poetry that we saw in Jave's work and read by some of his collaborators was written by both human and artificial intelligence. And again, that concatenation of the intelligences, making us aware of how much of our intelligence is artificial and given to us, is something that a work like this accomplishes. The Gathering Cloud by J.R. Carpenter. If we look at the frontispiece, we're told that the cloud is an airily deceptive name connoting a floating world far removed from the physical realities of data. Data centers worldwide use 30 billion watts of electricity annually. Most of that is spent on avoiding downtime, guarding against the event of grid failure. Banks of generators emit diesel exhaust. This is another normative condition that is known to science, that is necessary to the digital era that we've entered. But it is not thought about. It is normative. It is just there. We tend to talk about like car exhaust or, like dumping pollutants into water, but we tend to think of the cloud as being like clean. We tend to think of technology as being clean because, in our apps and in our computers, what I'm using right now, it's very well organized and very clear. But the environmental damage is enormous. And imagining environmental damage is also one of the challenges of our time. So this is where I think literature has a role in ecological thought, in the imagination of our encounters with media. Media are not things that we communicate with so much as they are how we interact with the world. And most of these interactions are not brought to consciousness. That's the role and the purpose of the literary, as J.R. Carpenter is doing here. About the clouds, a book I would recommend strongly is The Marvelous Clouds by John Durham Peters. Through an encyclopedic array of examples from the oceans to the skies, The Marvelous Clouds reveals the long prehistory of so-called new media. And again, I've been arguing for a long prehistory of literature that needs to be recovered for the literary to be able to continue in the current media environment. It's not simply to extend realism and modernism, but to take the longer view. And Peters gets that longer view. New media do not take us into uncharted waters, but rather confront us with the deepest and oldest questions of society and ecology, how to manage the relations people have with themselves, others, and the natural world. I heard Peters give a presentation of mostly 19th century art and all the clouds there. He said nothing about the digital until the last 2 minutes of his talk, when he said that the digital are not clear and life-giving. They have nothing to do with clouds. And he says, I want the term back in order to talk about the larger, longer aesthetic. I'm going to skip this one. I'm going to end with Senzabat by the Polish artist, writer, Piotr Marecki. And I also wanted to let you know about the ELMSIP database, because I think it's the most centralized database for the electronic literature, and I would recommend scanning this and following some of the descriptions here. Senzabat is a simple Twitter bot that tweets fragments from real historical censorship reviews of publications from the communist era. Marecki grew up in the communist era in Poland, and so he knows what he's talking about there. He came up with the idea to tweet fragments of censors' reviews after the Twitter bot purge. So like Carpenter, with Marecki, we get a sense of an ending, that things are, finishing up, that when you produce a work, it's going to disappear, and its disappearance is its realization. The idea that we are in a time when we're losing species, when nature is, as known, is being transformed. This too is this long tradition of the end of literature, I think, needs to integrate itself with the other endings that are going on all around us. And that's what we see in Carpenter, in Marecki. And one thing I will end with in talking about this is that that's actually just a comment of Marecki's that is in this space. But for the databases on literature to really work, we need more people writing about it. Without the response, you don't have a literature. Without the paratext, the things that people say about work, you don't have a field. The record status of this passage is not yet reviewed. Any and all of you are welcome to go in, write about it, and participate in the emergence of the field.
So, time for questions. I think I'll take the first question if you don't mind, because of the invitation Professor Tabbi gave all of you to participate in this electronic literature by being, the critics who write and that link. So, exactly how do you go and comment on this?
These are all the ones that aren't yet reviewed. I haven't actually written one. I write for the Electronic Literature Directory, and it gets produced here. But I would just, click in, read it. So, and let's see, where do you, anthology? Yeah, I'm not logged in, but, and just send it to send it to the person who's running it. I think that her name is Hannah Ackermans. Is the last person I interacted with, and again, I'm not logged in, but that should be evident. For the electronic literature directory, it's Will Lures, who is, and the managing editor is Danny Spinoza. So those are given on the site.
Yeah. Questions, comments?
I think it's interesting the conversation on going from movie one day and everything you see in like normal literature and going to the strange. Like that's interesting.
I don't think realism, which is the dominant mode of literature in our time, and it's research. After postmodernism, people got scared, say, wait a minute, enough with the irony already, enough with the self-reflexivity and all that complexity. Let's get real again. I don't think that's been very helpful in imagining the particular emergences and emergencies of our time. So that's why I don't think it's important to come on, people, get real. Don't you know that that global warming is real? That's not going to work. That hasn't worked. Better to get surreal.
What does that mean to you all? To get surreal? Do you know what he means? What he's asking you to do?
Dreamlike. So out of the box?
Yes.
Yeah, think outside the box. Yeah, but to think outside the box, you have to know what the boundaries are. You have to know what the constraints are. And again, like let's just use as the example, since the Microsoft protecting of programming information, it's hard to know where the box is. And that's a political, not a literary issue, is getting those things in place. To be repurposed, reoriented.
So you brought up consciousness, you brought up surrealism, which is like a releasing of the unconscious. Is there a return to psychology or psychologism in this work that you're talking about?
A return that recognizes that our unconscious is embedded and embodied. That it's a ecological and material unconscious more than an abstract one, and the recognizing that human agency is very small compared to our effects just by the waste we produce and the food we ingest by living. Our agency is very small compared to those effects in the ecology. And I would say that that's always been the case with consciousness and cognition as well. Consciousness is a very small part of cognition. It's one of my arguments in cognitive fictions. Just as human agency is we're not able to control and carefully curate our ecology. That agency is much smaller than the kinds of shifts we're seeing in the contemporary ecology. So it's in that sense of recognizing that the human is a very narrowly constrained role, and that what we don't know is much larger than what we can't control is much larger than what we can. Yes.
So you talked about the physical dimensions of technology, the material dimensions of technology. So I don't know if the students know what the materiality of literature means. So that's what he's talking about. It's the physicality of whatever you're using to write.
whatever you're using to communicate, the physicality of the book, the space, the computer, shapes literature, and you're saying that needs to be a part of literary production. And I kept thinking, doesn't that just take care of itself? Like, there's always going to be some physical dimension to whatever situation you're in, and that will influence the way that you think. And you kept saying that hiding the technology, that Microsoft moved to hide the code behind the what do they call it? GUI? The image of the desktop and and everything actually puts a damper on literary production. But isn't it just another material, physical, it's just another technology that will produce a different kind of thought? Why would it be better to have the code be transparent and available to everyone?
I mean, that's how we got the actual advances on science, was from sharing information among scientists. And I think that's the only way we're going to get literature, is by having literature in a Creative Commons database. That's why I think the Creative Commons was the most important and most promising development for literary studies. Like when you have a work, what you said is right. Then that's the materiality, and go with it. But when you're creating new ways of thinking, which we need to share the constraints. All know what constraints we're working with. We need so that's another thing is, Queneau is sharing the idea that, a page can be cut and you don't have to read, linearly. And that's, once you do that, then you have, like, the Oulipo was not just Queneau, it was a whole network of writers that came up with other similar things that, oh my gosh, this actually worked. I'm going to write a novel without the letter E. It's easier in French if you're Georges Perec than it is in English, because because you've got like la instead of le all the time. So, you can use feminine, words and get away with more. But still, there are hundreds of Oulipo developments. That was a very strict and primarily conceptual movement. I think that needs to expand into the dominant. That's another way of putting my argument.
DJ Spooky was here a few weeks ago, and he was asked a similar question. He didn't answer it. If y'all were listening, he didn't answer this question. That is, what role does copyright play in all this? Because that software is proprietary, it's owned by Microsoft. They don't want you to know how it works. If you know how it works, then you can reproduce it. And, with DJ Spooky, with all the music and mixing sort of indiscriminately things and putting them out on the internet, he was asked the question, what role does copyright play as a constraint to doing this, or as a constraint to art? And I guess you'll get the same question. There's a certain freedom that you get by going to the website or this link and having all this literature up there for you to experiment with, play with, use, create, make. But when there's copyright and someone owns that paragraph, that book, it creates problems. So talk about, what are your thoughts on copyright and sort of its constraints to electronic literature?
Well, I can only speak with any authority about academic copyright. And I think that the model we should have is like a year or two. And then where you have to buy the book, if you're publishing a book. But then at a certain point, then it should be able to be available on the internet for free, which is where most people, encounter anything they're reading. Okay? You have to make a particular physical move to a library to take out a book, or you have to order from a publisher to get a book. If we're talking about academic writing, which is all about sharing knowledge, then after a certain time, it should be made available in the commons. And I think universities are the places best suited to do that, not publishers. But I think that could be a very comfortable, agreement. And it is happening. I can name some places that do this between publishers and academic institutions.
Last comment, from me, so you notice the early poems that were mixed, Emily Dickens and Melville. They're the common property of all of us. They're not under copyright. You can do anything you want with them. And it's around 100 years, 50 years. After that period, all of that literature, all of that music, you can do whatever you want with it. You can put your name on it. You can mix or remix. It's the past 100 years, maybe 20th century into our century, where copyright is a huge, huge constraint with literature, with music, and the arts. And it's really interesting, I think, with Dr. Tabbi's presentation, its conversation with DJ Spooky, but they're actually talking and mixing and remixing in the same zone, but from different points of view. From the point of view of literature here, and his more from the point of view of music. You get the environment as well. It came up with in his talk, going to Antarctica. You got it here. So I love that conversation that you guys are having performed right in front of you through the reading series. It's great. So I want to thank you.